Welcome back to another episode of Dr. Schwartz and Mr. Power. I'm your host, Mr. Power. Unfortunately, we're missing one half of our team as Dr. Schwartz takes a podcasting deload this week. Think of this as a soliloquy episode. And since all the best soliloquies are relatively short, this will be a mini episode. So, what better topic than the topic of a short planned break in your training? That's right, we're going to get into planned deloads. We'll start by defining what exactly a deload is, and then a bit of short history on where the idea came from and how it ended up on the radar of your average gym goer and influencers. Then we'll get into whether or not you should be applying deloads to your training, and if so, when and how. But first, if you love our show, don't forget to do all the things such as like, subscribe, leave nice comments. You can also find us on Instagram and YouTube at Praxis Strength and Nutrition, respectively. Or you can check out our website, praxispn.com. That's praxispn.com. Now, let's get on with the show. So what's a deload and why do we do it? A deload is a planned decrease in either training volume or intensity, or both, with the goal of facilitating recovery. Simple enough on the face of it, so why is it so contentious? Well, partly because being contentious is what the internet's all about. That's how you get attention. That said, there are some legitimate points and debate around the topic, and they generally revolve around some version of the following ideas and assumptions. 1. Long-term training is optimized if you regularly achieve a high level of recovery. That is, fatigue is minimized. 2. Training should alternate between periods of overreaching and recovery. We'll get into what that means later. 3. Deloads decrease the risk of injury. 4. Deloads resensitize the muscle to training stimulus, thus leading to better long-term gains. So I'll speak to each of these points and finish with some useful recommendations. But first, a bit of context. And that starts with the history of the deload. Like most basic ideas in strength and conditioning, it's actually pretty difficult to pin down the specific origin of ideas. So the earliest modern reference to the idea that athletes should optimize their recovery so as to minimize ongoing fatigue is from the Russian text Olympic Sport by Boris Kotov. I haven't actually read this text as I'm unaware of a translated version and I don't read Russian. I can't even find an original Russian version, actually, which, if he were here, Dr. Schwartz could read for us, although I'm not sure it would be worth the trouble, to be honest. Anyway, Olympic Sport and other articles and books by Kotov are generally viewed as the progenitors of modern approaches to periodization. I say modern because authors will often refer back to ancient Greek texts that refer to breaking training up into specific periods with specific goals, but I don't want to give the impression of continuity between those ideas and what we think of now as periodization. So, periodization, of course, is the de facto approach to planned training for athletes. This isn't going to be an episode on periodization per se, but for those who don't know, periodization is the long-term planning of sports training based on the idea of breaking up training into different periods with discrete goals or emphasis, such as technique improvement, hypertrophy, competition, etc. Often these periods are planned as 4 to 6 week blocks, hence the name periodization. It's worth noting that unlike much of the Russian-based material, Kotov's writings aren't Soviet, as they were published before the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917. If you're interested in this, there's an interesting article on the history of periodization, a couple actually, that I'll post in the show notes. But as you might have guessed, this turns into a discussion about Soviet models of athlete development pretty quickly. The Soviet Union really did carry the torch in ideas about periodization right up until the 80s, where it started to become more widespread in other countries, or certainly the language around it. If Kotov laid out the early ideas for periodization, Lev Medvedev's periodization of sports training, or Lev Medvedev's, that's the author. I apologize for any Russian speakers who don't like my accent. I have no idea, and Schwartz isn't here to help me. Titled Periodization of the Sportive Training, pulled together and synthesized the most recognizable modern ideas of periodization. This book was published in 1965, and it was actually Medvedev's PhD thesis. So it's worth pausing here because we're going to sort of refer back, or these are these founding documents. So it's worth pausing to point out that at the time, there's very little physiological underpinning to any of these theories or periodization in general. And that's just an artifact of the time. It's 1965. And, you shouldn't fault the authors for this. They were working with what they had. So if we take these texts and we jump forward to the 1980s, you have a text, for example, A System of Multi-Year Training in Weightlifting. That was published in 1986 by Alexei Medvedev, not to be confused with the aforementioned Medvedev. Again, this might be more clear, the distinction, if I spoke Russian, which I don't. So in this text, you'll already see, clear or a bias towards regular undulations in weekly training loads. This has become the norm. So you would have a easy week followed by a hard week, and then a medium week and a hard week and an easy week. And then for clarity, we're talking about the sport of Olympic weightlifting here. So the title, when they talk about weightlifting, they're not talking about, casual gym goers or people who lift weights, but the clean and jerk and the snatch. So a common feature of the prescribed approach in this text and similar texts is regular weeks of low training load where lifters decrease the number of lifts to about 60% of normal. It varies a bit, but there's also a decrease typically in the relative intensity. So they lift lighter weights. And, we're going through all this because the Soviets had a big impact on Olympic weightlifting training outside the USSR, as well as sports training more generally. And a lot of the ideas we still use now, you can find their, again, origin in a lot of the Soviet texts and ideas around periodization, and they still get a fair bit of airtime. Case in point. Okay, so by the late 90s and early 2000s, Westside Barbell, a powerlifting club, maybe better described as a cult, popularized the translated Soviet texts in the powerlifting community, and these ideas started to seep into the strength training and fitness community more generally. So to be clear, I've painted a very simplified story, and there are many others who've popularized and further developed these models of undulated training loads. So don't come at me with complaints about not mentioning your favorite figure in periodization research. Honestly, though, if people do want a historic deep dive into the history and development of these training ideas, let us know. I think it would be interesting, but don't want to bore people. All right, so putting it together, basically the idea of regular pre-planned deloads comes from early theories of periodization, and they found their way into the general fitness community through Olympic weightlifting and track and field via powerlifting. We didn't really touch on the track and field, but it's a similar story. Okay, so back to our original question. What should should you plan regular deloads in your training? So should you have, every 4 to 8 weeks, a week where you deliberately reduce your training volume and intensity by some pre-prescribed percent, often to about 60% if you go by the early literature on it? The short answer is probably not. So at the beginning of the episode, I mentioned some of the rationale used to justify deloads. So I'll go through those in turn. So number one, this is the idea that long-term progress is optimized by regularly achieving full or near full recovery. In other words, if you don't want to be fatigued a lot for a lot of the time. Kotov advanced this idea in 1917 with no evidence, and it seems to be an idea that just won't die. And honestly, there's not much reason to think that it would be true. The whole premise of strength training is applying a stress to the body that it has to adapt to. If you regularly allow your body to fully recover, there's not much reason for it to bother with physiologically expensive adaptations like remodeling tissue or growing new muscle. We'll get into why this is sort of more of a deep dive into the physiology of why you need sustained stress on the body in order for it to make sustained long-term adaptations in our upcoming episode about muscle memory and muscle learning. But for now, suffice to say, this really is an idea without a lot of backing. Idea number two, overreaching and supercompensation. Okay, so this is the idea that training should be structured such that you have periods of overreaching. That is, training loads that are basically impossible to sustain long-term, hence the term overreaching. These overreaching periods are then followed by planned deloading periods where your body can recover and supercompensate. The idea being here that you will then achieve a new higher performance level that you would not have achieved had you not done this overreaching and subsequent supercompensation period or deloading period. So you might notice this is sort of the opposite justification of the first point for the same strategy, which should be a bit of a red flag for both of these ideas. You can use this strategy successfully, and people certainly have, where you do periods of, blocks of deliberate overreaching followed by sort of deloading blocks or short deloading periods. But there's also no good evidence that it's any better than just selecting a more appropriate load for the entire period in question. For example, you can just average the overreach and recovery training loads into a more manageable training load without the drastic ups and downs. So, you can imagine doing the same amount of work in 8 weeks, but without the really intense weeks and without the really easy weeks. Incidentally, the second method is also easier to manage in monitoring when thinking about the athlete's ability to tolerate the load. Okay, so number 3, instituting deloads to reduce injury risk. So the injury risk article is probably the one that makes the most sense from both a logical and a mechanistic standpoint. So most strength training injuries are of the overuse variety. You perform similar loaded movements over and over, which can lead to tendinopathies and poorly recovered muscles, among other things. As such, regular deloads should give these tissues an opportunity to recover, leading to fewer injuries. However, if you need a planned deload every 4 to 8 weeks, the most commonly recommended frequency, you're not really managing your load properly, your training load. Or at least I would argue that. Essentially, you're starting to venture into the overreach model of training, whether deliberately or not. Okay, so the final one, and I saved this for last on purpose because that's where it belongs, resensitization. So you'll hear this term thrown around a lot, and it is an idea. It's been around for a long time, and I feel like lately it's gained a little purchase because I don't know, I've been coming across it more. And so this is the idea that by taking a break from training, your muscle or physiology or whatever become more sensitive to the training stimulus. So it's as though, you develop a resistance to the stimulus provided by training. And then by taking a deload week, you let that mystery resistance sort of abate, and then you're more sensitive to the training effect again. Honestly, this idea is dumb as hell and belies a basic lack of understanding of physiology. I'm honestly shocked at how many sports science types who really should know better actually entertain this idea. The reason you feel resensitized after a prolonged periods of not training is because you're detrained, and muscle memory, which we'll definitely do in a episode soon, makes it easier to get back to where you were. For the record, I will die on this hill. The idea of muscle resensitization is worse than nonsense because it leads to counterproductive approaches to training. So yeah, that theory is trash. So when and why should you deload? Here, Dr. Schwartz and Mr. Power, we believe in giving useful advice. So what's the useful advice about deloading? Firstly, don't have planned deload periods. Usually if you're having planned deload periods, they're either unnecessary or you're misplanning your load. Instead, try to manage your training load better from week to week. It's okay to be tired and a bit beat up sometimes. This is normal. But you also shouldn't feel like training is insurmountable and each week of training is digging you into a deeper and deeper hole from which you can't reasonably recover. The flip side of this is to think of training as if you are really dreading training week after week and it just feels like you're just so beat down and you're not making progress, you're probably training a bit too hard. Conversely, if you're trying to get stronger, faster, or muscular, or whatever it is, you should have no reasonable expectation of always feeling fresh and ready to perform your best. For example, it's well established in the research, and I'll post some stuff in the show notes as usual, that periods of hard training, particularly when undertaking higher volumes of training, will reduce maximum power output. But this is a temporary effect. This drop in power output rebounds quickly as training volume decreases when, for instance, preparing for competition. And the article that I'll post in the show notes looks at this in Olympic weightlifters and the amount of power they're able to generate in the snatch, the faster of the two movements, while undertaking heavy strength training periods in their blocks in their periodized program. But you can't always plan perfectly, which brings the next point. Sometimes you think your training regime is reasonable and it turns out not to be, whether because you allocated the training load or because something else in life made the training harder. You're not sleeping well, you're busy at work, you just had a baby, whatever. So what do you do there? Well, in that case, it's fine to back off a bit. That's a perfectly reasonable approach. However, this doesn't mean you have to automatically drop volume and intensity to 60%. Again, our example number that's thrown around quite a bit. Backing off could just mean for a couple days, or maybe removing a couple exercises on one day of training or 2 days of training. And this is sort of part of the art of coaching, or even just coaching yourself. And it takes a bit of practice and judgment. This comes with time. So again, how do you get there? Well, don't worry. If you get it wrong, it's not usually a big deal. For instance, if you have a week that you've decided, okay, I'm training too much or I'm not recovering for whatever reason, back off a little bit. If you still feel like crap the next week, back off a little more. Not a big deal. You don't have to nail it perfectly every time. In fact, you can pretty much guarantee you're not going to nail it perfectly because physiology is hard. And, if you back off too much, you'd be a little more aggressive. Not a big deal. All right. And so finally, don't forget the recovery side of training. If you're struggling with your training load, ask yourself, is your nutrition in order? Or if your sleep is adequate? These are the two biggest things you can do in terms of recovery, much more than any hokey ice bath nonsense or even things that I think are good, like massage. They don't do much. If you're not sleeping well and you're not eating well, everything else is just going to fall apart. Anyone who's ever had a baby or, worked shift work can tell you this. There's just nothing like sleep and a regular schedule to make you feel like an entirely different person. All right. So as promised, that was a mini episode. This brings us to the end. Very short, fair bit of information though. We got straight to the point. That's it for me today. We'll be back next week with a full complement of Alex's. Take care. Have a great day.